12 marked the first time a solo 3D world could be manipulated with a free-roaming camera. This allowed the player to have full range of motion and vision for the characters at all times. In addition, a new battle system was designed to accommodate a more immediate and intuitive playstyle, similar to the online engagements of Final Fantasy XI. 12 introduced active dimension battles, which eliminated random encounters completely. All enemies were now visible and subject to rules of aggression. Although characters could be controlled manually, 12 incorporated a macro-like system for inactive characters called gambits, which allowed them to act on their own in real time based on a number of criteria. As different sections of the gambit formula were purchased or found, more complex gambits could be made. This allowed for fast and fierce battles that required very little downtime. Vaughn and his compatriots added their experience to a leveling system called the License Grid. Tying to the theme of law and judgment, the License Grid required characters to purchase permissions to use different spells, weapons, and armor. Characters still increased in level, although abilities were acquired solely through obtaining licenses. Regardless of the experience total certain enemies yielded upon death, the license points awarded were relatively standard, making the grind for abilities painless. However, due to certain plot restrictions relating to when certain abilities could be obtained or purchased, grinding license points sometimes became futile and unnecessary. The Ivalice of 12 maintained many concepts of Tactics Advance, which was the first time two Ivalices bore apparent similarities. The new races introduced in Advance returned in more intricate and expansive capacities. Judges played a very large role in 12, and several areas, such as the Yags, were explored or referred to. Mont Blanc also made a side appearance as well, as the leader of Clan Centurio, which aided Vaughn in his monster hunting endeavors. Mont Blanc's appearance also solidified that the timelines of 12 and Tactics Advance were relatively close, Tactics Advance likely being the prequel. Another aspect of Advance that carried over was the introduction of a completely new pantheon of summonable creatures, known as Espers. 12 marked the first time a given term was repeated to describe summoned creatures, as well as the first time in the numeric series since summoning was introduced that featured a totally different group of mystical beings. Shiva, Ifrit, and Ramu were replaced with Matius, Belias, and Adramelech, among others. Elemental strengths became less of a focus, as each Esper corresponded with the sign of the zodiac. Each Esper needed to be bound to a given character. Once selected, the choice could not be undone. In addition to the pure strength of the summoned creature, the characters could also unleash quickenings, powerful chain attacks that drew upon their mystical energy.
Should Empire join with Empire, the way will open for a new Ivalice in our time.
12 continued to move forward and refine Final Fantasy's voice acting. Extremely long pauses, odd vocalizations, and other glitchy elements were drastically minimized. The voices were brought down from the exaggerations of 10 and given a more legitimate tone. Even more heavy hitters in the voiceover community continued to flesh out the cast. John DiMaggio, who lent his talents to 10 as well, was followed by fellow Futurama alumnus Phil Lamar, who brought life to Redis. As part of the 20th anniversary celebration, 12 was given a brief makeover for its international release in August of 2007. The license grid was replaced with the Zodiac job system, which required characters to choose one of 12 smaller grids that corresponded to a particular job and sign of the Zodiac. Guest characters and Espers could now be controlled by the player. New Gambit spells and licenses were incorporated, and a new Game Plus feature was added, similar to Final Fantasy X-2. It's unknown whether the release calendar of the 4 Ivalice games so far is indicative of the chronological telling of Ivalice's story. Tactics takes place on a peninsula closed in by the land of Ordalia to the east. Vagrant Story runs through the city of Leamond, and continually references the kingdom of Valendia. Tactics Advance is hard to assimilate geographically in the timeline because the map is constructed by the player. The Ivalice in 12, however, included both Valendia and Ordalia with minor spelling adjustments, despite the fact that the locations within them completely changed. It also contained several locations plotted in Tactics Advance. This led fans to assume that the block of land in the original Tactics sits on the west rim of the 12 map, possibly revealing that the Ivalice in the first PlayStation game expanded across several continents while growing over time into the overworld on the PS2. Several facts both support and destroy this theory. The bestiary in Final Fantasy XII was compiled by a woman with the last name Merlos, who might be a relative to the heroine in Vagrant Story, or Callow herself. And several of the items in Vagrant Story allude to characters from Tactics and Return. But according to Tactics, Moogles are extinct, so their inclusion in Final Fantasy XII might force the original Ivalice adventure to the end of the timeline. There are numerous theories, and none of them are correct until confirmed by the developers. But here's one we found the most interesting. Suppose Tactics and Vagrant Story were precursors to Tactics Advance, with the non-Moogle religious era eventually transforming into Saint Ivalice, similar to how Constantinople became Istanbul. Then, Moot and friends created an alternate Ivalice with their minds, one that added their favorite fantasy friends like Moogles, and new races like the Bonga and Viera. They eventually returned home, but what if this dream dimension lived on, and set the stage for Final Fantasy XII? The developers have confirmed several times that Tactics, Tactics Advance, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII all take place in the same world. But the order and relation of these chapters in Ivalice still remains a mystery. Hopefully, the sequels that have yet to be released will shed some light on the subject. In December of 2006, Square initiated the Ivalice Alliance, a series of titles all linked together by the continuing narrative of Matsuno's world. Its first entry, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, was released on April 26, 2007 in Japan. The DS RTS was unlike any previous FF release, handheld or otherwise, engaging the player in complex real-time face-offs with touchpad controls. Final Fantasy Tactics A2, another DS battle simulator, is currently under development and will be placed chronologically behind Final Fantasy XII. And a remake of the original PlayStation Crusade launched on the PSP subtitled The War of the Lions. The portable port featured new items, jobs, and full-motion cutscenes detailing major plot developments and boss encounters. However the 6 chapters in the saga of Ivalice eventually come together, the kingdom itself stands as the most expansive setting ever created in the Final Fantasy universe, and even more adventures could lie in waiting. The name Ivalice only vaguely represents a solitary region of its planet's surface, so as the Alliance marches on, there's no telling where it will end. Next week, we go beyond the franchise into the entities that sit at the edge of what's considered canon. These random experiments include a handheld adventure, a mystical quest, a surprisingly long string of chocobo trials, and the various franchise leaps from the small set to the silver screen.